So I was planning on having this video out a few weeks ago, but there were a few problems on my end. A hurricane caused 3 trees to hit my house, and a bunch of power lines were disconnected for a few days, and the internet didn't come back to proper functionality for a few weeks. So that's kind of been my life the past month. But anyway, moving on, we're here now. And this is the video for Crash Bandicoot I've been wanting to make for a month. Enjoy. Crash Bandicoot 4 It's About Time is an ode to 1990s nostalgia. Sans a skateboard or an obsession with Hanson, this new Toys for Bob developed late sequel to the beloved Naughty Dog PlayStation 1 era trilogy of mascot platformers is filled with all the familiar gameplay garnishes that made Crash, no relation, a millennial cultural touchstone back when the series debuted in 1996. The game features fun platforming, a lighthearted story, collectibles, Wumpa Fruit, crates, low-key racism, and the spin attack, i.e. the most satisfying melee attack of any platformer ever, which is just a fact. And due to all these reasons and more, Crash Bandicoot 4 It's About Time is a blast from the past, the Crash game that fans like myself have been chomping at the bit for in the decade since Crash Bandicoot Warped concluded as Naughty Dog's final salvo for the franchise back in 1998. It really is the Crash sequel we've been waiting for. Admittedly, it was not smooth sailing for the franchise to reach this point. There technically have been other Crash games in the intervening years. When original developer Naughty Dog was unable to retain the Crash Bandicoot rights after being acquired by Sony in 2001, third-party developers like Traveler's Tales made games like Crash Bandicoot The Wrath of Cortex and Crash Twinsanity. And spoiler alert, they weren't very good. These games lacked the same fire and pizzazz as the earlier entries. They were not as well-rounded and meticulously well-designed like the Naughty Dog titles. Even though these games had the similar aesthetically pleasing accoutrements as the more beloved Crash titles, these games felt off, like ketchup on a hot dog, or Ubisoft with sexual harassment training. Games like Crash Bandicoot The Wrath of Cortex and Crash Twinsanity suffered from mediocre design that deviated from Crash's core gameplay principles. When you compare them to the old Naughty Dog games, the camera was atrocious and the deaths were cheaper than $4 wine. They were quite janky. Yet Crash Bandicoot 4 succeeds where all these other sequels failed. The new adventure acts as a soft reboot, negating all the post-Naughty Dog Crash escapades, and is the direct sequel to Crash Bandicoot Warped. In terms of its story and gameplay style, Crash Bandicoot 4 It's About Time resembles the old Crash. The plot follows Crash, Coco, and Aku Aku as they hop between dimensions, defeat enemies, and perform daring acrobatic feats in order to, yet again, defeat their world domination aspiring evil scientist arch-nemesis Dr. Neo Cortex. And whether due to the story or the gameplay style, Crash Bandicoot 4 is quintessential Crash, a twisted platformer that amuses and challenges in equal measure, picking up where the series' narrative and gameplay innovations left off more than 20 years ago. Essentially, Crash Bandicoot 4 It's About Time is true to the spirit of the old games. It dotingly recreates, enhances, and revitalizes Crash's franchisal formula, which is basically everything that a longtime fan like myself could hope for in 2020, current year apocalypse aside. However, Crash Bandicoot 4 It's About Time and the Naughty Dog era games have more in common than just unique traits that are inherent to being a good Crash Bandicoot game. After all, if developing Crash titles were simply about copying and pasting the satisfying surface level elements within the series, the Crash franchise would have maintained pop culture relevance for a longer period of time than just the late 90s. It would have had staying power akin to other platformers like Mario
Mario, and Sonic. But instead, the Crash series fell into obscurity, becoming less and less essential with each passing iteration, like Dexter after Season 4.
And yet, developer Toys for Bob stuck the landing with the latest Crash Bandicoot.
Crash 4 compares incredibly well to the Crash games of old. The platforming is on point, the difficulty is devilish, and most of the new elements complement the series' fundamental gameplay conceit in that it mixes 2D and 3D platforming.
And that mixture of 2D and 3D platforming is key to understanding the appeal of Crash Bandicoot. And to fully understand why Crash Bandicoot 4 is so good, we first need to dive into a brief history of 3D platformers and Naughty Dog's original trio of Crash Bandicoot titles. So without further ado, here we go.
Three-dimensional platformers were innovative back in the 90s. Then new consoles like the first PlayStation and the Nintendo 64 were huge technological leaps from the previous generation of the Super Nintendo Entertainment System or the Sega Genesis.
And this upgraded technology fundamentally changed what a platformer could possibly be when compared to previous console generations.
Platformers on systems like the SNES and the Sega G were mostly two-dimensional affairs, side-scrollers where you could only move to the right or left on screen while the camera tracks you. Yet with the upgrade of the PlayStation 1 and the Nintendo 64, developers were able to create three-dimensional arenas where the player could freely move around and control the camera, offering an all-around new way to experience a platformer.
And make no mistake, 3D platformers were a big deal back then.
Super Mario 64, Donkey Kong 64, Spyro, Banjo-Kazooie, Croc, Gex, and so many more 3D platformers flooded the marketplace.
In that era, platformers were everywhere. They were essentially the video game equivalent of a Tribble.
While two-dimensional platformers still had an audience and would eventually make a comeback and be popular as a retro-style genre in its own right, every game company and their mother demanded their own mascot 3D platformer akin to Super Mario 64, and most companies and franchises really cashed in on this 3D platformer trend, going all in on a full 3D experience.
Of all these great 3D platformers though, there was one really notable exception to the rule.
Crash Bandicoot was not a traditional 3D platformer. Despite having three-dimensional elements like in how the playable character can move forward and backward, and in how the environment is much more maneuverable, Crash Bandicoot differed from the likes of Super Mario 64 in its 3D platforming ilk by having features like a fixed camera that the player couldn't control, as well as featuring more traditional two-dimensional side-scrolling platforming sections. Sure, the player could move forward and backward in 3D sections, but the camera always tracks the character rather than letting us control it, which was different from most 3D platformers at the time.
The games essentially acted as a combination of two-dimensional and three-dimensional platformers that mess with the player's sense of perspective.
Crash Bandicoot was a mix and match of both two-dimensional and three-dimensional elements that allowed the series to carve out its own niche among its full 3D platforming competitors like Mario, Spyro, and Bubsy. And while Crash was not the first platformer of this style, it was undeniably the most popular and had the most appeal.
It was lightning, no relation, in a bottle, and make no mistake, kids loved Crash Bandicoot.
Crash Bandicoot's gameplay was especially accessible to younger gamers. Most 3D platformers and other games with 3D environments like action games or first-person shooters required you to control the camera, which was and still remains a major entry barrier for new players, young and old, that can prevent people from enjoying a game. Yet Crash Bandicoot automatically handles the camera for the player. Where most old and new 3D games have complex controls, Crash Bandicoot is very accessible. It's very easy to jump in and play, And because of this, many people in their 20s and 30s, i.e. millennials, and hell, even people who don't really play video games anymore or ever, can talk at length about how much they loved Crash. Due to the automatic camera, that said entry barrier that prevents kids and new players from enjoying games like GoldenEye did not apply to Crash, and as a result, it was a big hit, a game that kids and younger people wanted to play with friends and siblings despite how it was single player. Kids would play the game and switch players upon death, essentially passing the PlayStation controller around as if they were huffing the good stuff. It was a communal experience.
Crash Bandicoot was fundamental to the upbringing of many a millennial gamer, and that includes myself.
For me, Crash Bandicoot 2 Cortex Strikes Back was one of the first games I ever played, and more importantly, the first game I ever loved. It's what made me realize how cool games could be as a medium.
And never mind the fact that my father bought Crash and a PlayStation 1 as a way for me to favor him over my mother during a rough time in their relationship.
I was hooked by the way that Crash combined 2D and 3D platforming styles.
Traumatized, but hooked.
However, Crash's tendency to combine 2D and 3D platformer styles together added more to the game than just accessibility alone. In fact, Crash's gameplay itself really complements Crash's identity of being a mishmash in how the games often switched between 3D platforming to 2D side-scrolling seamlessly, often doing so within the same level, which was quite an impressive feat from a game design standpoint.
In other words, the old games offered the best of both worlds when it came to two-dimensional and three-dimensional platforming, and this allowed the Crash series to have its own unique identity as a platformer and its own game design intricacies.
Most of Crash Bandicoot's challenge resided in how it toyed with the player's sense of perspective, even beyond how the games alternated between 2D and 3D with ease. The game's automatic control of the camera allowed the developers to play devious mind games with the player, creating deliberate hurdles meant to kill the player by making us miss core details necessary for survival. The games threw everything in the dirty kitchen sink at the player, simultaneously making us fret about moving platforms, a variety of enemy types, collectibles that required the player to take a risk, boxes of TNT and nitro that explode, terrain changes like ice and mud, lighting, and etc. in rapid-fire succession. Different from other platformers, Crash Bandicoot is not just about the ability to make and time difficult jumps. Instead, it is about assessing the nearly overwhelming amount of obstacles that the devilish game designers chuck at you, and committing to a plan to overcome them. Levels like the High Road required the player to navigate a collapsing bridge with laser precision, and a level like Behaving's difficult platforming had to be done under the threat of being chased by a swarm of bees, which made a lot of young players channel their inner Nicolas Cage.
The games used whatever avenue they could to mess the player up. Was it always fair? Hell no! But way more often than not, dying in a Crash game was more the fault of the player missing a key important detail than the game itself. It usually walked the line between being fair and being cheap pretty well.
The level variety enhanced this challenge. While there was minimal in the way of diverse level design in the first Crash Bandicoot, Naughty Dog really experimented with their winning formula with each successive installment. Aside from the trademarked platforming, the first game contained levels where you ran away from boulders. Crash Bandicoot 2 Cortex Strikes Back added levels with waveboarding and jetpacks, and Crash Bandicoot Warped featured racing sections, scuba diving levels, and gameplay sections featuring jet skis and airplanes. Naughty Dog really went all out on that one.
Whatever the case, the Naughty Dog era Crash games threw whatever they could at the player, making us reevaluate how we approach any given level or gameplay scenario.
The Crash series additionally expanded in theme with each successive Naughty Dog entry. As the series progressed, Naughty Dog changed our understanding of what a Crash Bandicoot game could be. The first Crash was rudimentary, featuring the typical franchise levels of rainforests, ruins, and laboratories. Crash 2 introduced snow levels and transported Crash to outer space, and Crash Bandicoot Warped sees Crash time traveling to exciting locales for some nifty platforming and increasingly complex boss battles. Add on the fact that each sequel had great quality of life improvements, the series was way beyond just being a mere simple mascot platformer.
It really had some technological and stylistic merits that allowed the games to stand out from their peers. And even after completing the game, you can't help but just to go back and play it again. It really had a lot of replay value.
Crash's smart design granted the series with near endless replayability, changing the way you can approach any gameplay scenario. All the games have secret challenge levels, optional gems to collect, boxes of Wumpa fruit to break, and in the case of Crash Bandicoot Warped, a time trial mode meant to really challenge longtime players who have developed a muscle memory sense of familiarity with the franchise on par with Limp Bizkit's innate ability to produce awful music.
When combining all of the Crash Bandicoot series strengths together, the identity of this platforming franchise becomes clear.
Whether it is Crash's nature as a platformer that combines 2D and 3D characteristics, its accessibility, how the games messed with our sense of perspective, the devious level design, diverse gameplay, and replayability, the adoration and nostalgic status the franchise receives from millennials is understandable. Naughty Dog era Crash Bandicoot titles were not just good games, they were a great entry point that new gamers could pick up and play with ease, and had very distinct gameplay. Even in an era oversaturated with mascot platformers vying for Mario's throne, Crash Bandicoot had character and succeeded by being its own style of platformer. For the 90s at least, Crash Bandicoot was Sony's and PlayStation's flagship franchise. It was iconic.
However, all this praise and these fond memories associated with Naughty Dog's original Crash Bandicoot titles had a drawback.
Naughty Dog era Crash Bandicoot was so good that every subsequent release in the franchise would always be compared unfavorably to the first three games. As stated earlier, Naughty Dog could not keep the franchise rights when they were acquired by Sony, meaning that a different studio would make later subpar entries. The aforementioned The Wrath of Cortex and Twinsanity's gameplay just was not as well balanced as the Naughty Dog era games, and the challenges veered into being cheap way too often, and due to how the quality of the gameplay pittered off, Crash Bandicoot faded from relevance, lost to the annals of video game history.
Or so it seemed. I don't know why I tried to make that sound ominous. I'm about as threatening as a kitten in Build-A-Bear Workshop. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is the newly released Crash Bandicoot 4 It's About Time is the Crash sequel that I've always craved.
Crash Bandicoot 4 It's About Time is so good that it should be impossible. Like having hope in mankind, the game being just as great as the Naughty Dog era Crash Bandicoot titles should not be possible. Sure, developer Toys for Bob did a terrific job remastering the titles in 2017's Crash Bandicoot Insane Trilogy, but Naughty Dog's original trio of Crash games were timeless. Even when the games were rough around the edges, the first Crash Bandicoot most notably, the great core gameplay made any issues irrelevant, and as a result, any potential modern-day entry in the series would endure heavy scrutiny from fans like myself who cherish the originals as sacred, as if it were an orange-furred baby Jesus wearing Brett Favre's blue jeans.
Would you like to work here? I'm not housebroken.
And yet, developer Toys for Bob have pulled off the impossible. Crash Bandicoot 4 It's About Time is easily and immediately comparable to Naughty Dog's Crash games and even matches them in quality.
Let's not mince words here. Crash Bandicoot 4 It's About Time is really damn good. And the reason behind its goodness, that's a weird way to phrase it.
Take two.
And the reason why Crash Bandicoot 4 is so good is because it contains many of the game design intricacies that made the original Naughty Dog Crash era games great.
Beyond all the typical characteristics inherent to a Crash game like crates, Wumpa fruit, and that damn sexy spin attack, Crash Bandicoot 4 It's About Time retains the essence of what made the original game so good, and even improves on these fundamental Crash Bandicoot traits, ensuring that the game feels modern despite its 90s platforming style. Through some form of witchcraft, Crash Bandicoot 4: It's About Time retains what made Crash so special in its heyday, while also feeling fresh and vibrant in 2020, which is a really tough high-wire act to walk, yet developer Toys for Bob does an admirable job.
Once again, this game is really damn good.
The most abundant of these intrinsic classic franchisal characteristics within Crash 4 is the game's style of being a hybrid between a 2D and a 3D platformer. Like the earlier Naughty Dog games, the player cannot control the camera. Instead, the camera automatically follows the player when moving, which allows the game to challenge the player's sense of perspective. The developers place many traps, obstacles, enemies, wall runs, rail sections, chase sequences, pitfalls, and etc. meant to play mind games with the player, meaning to fool you into mistiming a jump or an attack. Hell, even regular boxes pose a threat now as if it were an Amazon warehouse.
There are hazards galore in Crash 4. Similar to the old games, Crash Bandicoot 4 is quite difficult. Hell, there was even one later level that I died 110 times on, and I know this because the game counts the amount of times you die per level, because it's a sadistic
However, Crash 4 does contain a few quality of life improvements and tweaks that help even the playing field. When jumping, the game has an indicator that informs the player where they are going to land. And while in the old games you could guesstimate where Crash would land based off of his shadow placement, this new noticeable marker delivers a clearer signal of where Crash is heading, making it much more easier to avoid falling into a pit of doom, which for Crash is an occupational hazard.
More importantly of these changes, though, is how Crash 4 modernizes the life system.
In ye olden games, Crash has a limited set of lives, and the player must either open specially marked boxes or earn 100 Wumpa Fruit, which nets 1 life. But Crash 4 has 2 different gameplay modes: in Classic, which is the aforementioned earlier mode, with lives and all that jazz, and Modern, which removes the need for lives, meaning that you have infinite respawns when you die.
Which, as far as life insurance policies go, is a hell of an improvement.
The newer Modern mode is the best way to experience Crash 4. While I understand the temptation to play the old school Classic mode, the Modern option surprisingly enhances the Crash Bandicoot experience for 2 reasons. Firstly, Crash 4 is even more difficult than earlier games, and the removal of lives allowed the game designers to have a field day in crafting wicked levels, traps, and such. After all, the game designers do not have to rein in their sadistic creativity as much when they don't have to worry about a player experiencing a game over screen over and over again. And secondly, having infinite lives allows the player to take more risks. As many of you know, Crash games place boxes and Wumpa Fruit in dangerously tantalizing situations because these games are tease. Yet, due to how the player does not have to fret about losing lives, the game rewards the player for being adventurous. Crash 4 essentially encourages the player to go after boxes and collectibles they otherwise would not have if they had to fear for their lives.
And yes, I am really proud of that wordplay.
Crash's new abilities further emphasize the franchise's challenge and focus on the series' penchant for messing with the player's sense of perspective. Crash 4 features new masks that alter the gameplay while also being culturally insensitive. And these masks offer a whole new dimension to the game, literally. The mask's powers range from teleporting items from alternating dimensions, a spinning jump attack, bullet time, and altering gravity, and all of them add their own unique challenges to the gameplay, change the way you approach any given gameplay scenario, make the boss fights really complicated and interesting in the best way, and pace out the comparatively standard bread and butter platforming accordingly.
The masks really do add a lot of variety to the gameplay, while also complementing the game's themes.
The thematic level design expands upon Naughty Dog's creativity in the earlier Crash games. In the prior canonical Crash game and Crash Bandicoot Warped, Naughty Dog really went all out with the time-traveling theme, crafting different levels with stunning creativity. And in Crash 4, Toys for Bob added their own nuances to the formula. More than just time travel, the game is a dimension-hopping extravaganza where Crash runs away from dinosaurs, swashbuckles with some pirates, battles on alien spaceships, and confronts a future violently hell-bent on recycling.
All these levels and themes add to Crash 4's sense of character and is true to the identity of the franchise as a whole.
However, it is Crash 4's replayability that really hammers home the point that Crash 4 is the true successor and sequel that fans have been waiting for. Even beyond all the collectibles, gems, boxes, secret levels, and time trial modes, Crash Bandicoot 4 It's About Time wows when it comes to giving you reasons to play and replay the game. There are extra stages designed like the challenge levels in the first Crash Bandicoot, an inverted mode that changes the visual style and direction of the levels, and most importantly, there are levels featuring different playable characters who will all have their own distinct play styles. These characters include alternate dimension Tana, who has a grapple hook, a deadly roundhouse kick, and an even deadlier glorious sapphic haircut. There's the reformed villain Dingodile, who has a cool air gun thingy, and then there's Neo Cortex, Crash's arch nemesis himself, who has a dash ability and a gun that transforms enemies into platforms. These different characters, alongside the extra levels and the inverted mode, make Crash 4 a game that I can't help but keep coming back to. Its replayability and wealth of content go well beyond merely being a nostalgic throwback. Crash Bandicoot 4 is legitimately great in modernity.
While the platforming is still classic, quintessential Crash Bandicoot, the new masks and the quality of life improvements like the modern mode and the jump icon allow the game to be just as fresh today as it was in its heyday 2 decades ago.
Crash Bandicoot 4 It's About Time is up to the high bar of quality set by the Naughty Dog games. Despite admittedly having some shortcomings, for example, a few gameplay sections are a bit too difficult and veer into being cheap, this game is true to the spirit of what this franchise is about, which is to say, a great combination of 2D and 3D platforming, grueling difficulty, stunning level design, and mega replayability. And this is to say nothing of the returning franchisal niceties like the satisfying sound of collecting Wumpa Fruit and the spin attack. But whatever the case, Crash 4 is everything that fans like myself have been clamoring for years. The game is gorgeous to look at, satisfying to play, and cements that Crash's popularity in the 90s wasn't a fluke. This style of platformer, whether they be the old Naughty Dog era games or Crash Bandicoot 4, has its own distinct personality and charm that still plays well today. Even though a lot about the video game industry has changed in the 22-year interim between Crash 3 and 4, Crash has proven itself to be timeless, and with Crash 4, the marsupial has returned to proper form.
And it is about damn time.
And with that, thank you for watching the video. Please leave a like rating and subscribe to my channel. And I would like to thank my patrons, especially my high tier ones in Slasher of Veils, Mom, and David Devlin. Thank you so much for supporting what I do. Love y'all.